Hi, I'm Jim Quadara, Business Development Manager at Scan Global Logistics, based in Tullamarine, and we're an international freight forwarder. To be an effective exporter, there's a few simple rules to follow. One is you need to be aware of the buying terms that your overseas customer is requesting from you. You need to be aware and understand Inco terms and what their implications are in international trade. You need to be able to construct a proper quotation for your potential buyer in line with their requirements. You need to know your rights and responsibilities as a seller. You need to be aware of Australian regulations and what's required to ship your goods out of the country. There's a number of areas that you need to comply with, which is customs. You need to understand what your responsibilities are to declare information to customs to be able to get permission to export your goods. And probably the most important thing in international trade is to have all your documentation prepared accurately, correctly, and on time. Incorrect and late documentation has the potential to derail a shipment, cause delays, additional expenses, and of course have disputes with your customer, which we'd like to avoid. To be able to comply with all the tasks just mentioned, you'll need to employ the services of an international freight forwarder. And basically an international freight forwarder is an organisation or company that manages your supply chain. Our responsibility is to coordinate and implement all the functions required to successfully ship your goods overseas. The international freight forwarder is the only entity in a supply chain that deals with all the other links in a supply chain. What's a supply chain? A supply chain is a group of companies or people that you need to interact with to again successfully execute your shipment overseas. So your supply chain can consist of your buyer, the bank, the local transport company to deliver your goods to the wharf, shipping lines, airlines, insurance companies to undertake marine insurance on the product, customs, quarantine, the Reserve Bank, and it can also extend to the overseas entities depending on what Inco term you need to sell on, and that will include the overseas customs, quarantine, transport and wharf organisations. So to undertake all these activities, it's very wise to employ the services of an international freight forwarder. So what's the role of international freight forwarder? Our role is to advise you on Inco terms, to help you construct quotes to comply with your potential buyer's requirements, to help you select which mode of transport is best for your shipment, whether it's by vessel or by air. Your overseas buyer may ask you to supply the goods within a certain time frame, so we will be able to investigate what options we have available. We can advise you on insurance. Marine insurance is not compulsory, but it is advisable. And that can be undertaken by either the buyer or the seller. Again, depending on Inco terms. We can help give you advice on packing specifications, whether palletisation is sufficient, whether you may need a wooden box, whether you may need protective covering. We advise you on marks and numbers, how to address and label your packages. We can assist you in the preparation of certificates of origin to assist you to comply with free trade agreements with those countries that have an agreement with Australia. We can also assist you with tariff advice and classification of product within the customs system to ensure that the correct duty and or taxes are paid at destination. And on some particular commodities or cargo, there are inspections required, whether they be by quarantine, and we can assist with phytosanitary certificates. It may be over-dimensional cargo, which can't be containerised, but needs to be inspected to ensure that it's properly secured to a flat rack, which is used to transport over-dimensional cargo. They're also used to inspect the condition of a cargo, especially if it's not containerised. Being exposed outside of a container, there is the risk of oxidisation. So it's important to know what the condition of the cargo is like prior to shipping. So what is an Incoterm? An Incoterm is probably one of the most important aspects of international trade. They're a set of rules issued by the International Chamber of Commerce in the 1930s, and they play a very important role in international trade. They denote the responsibilities of both the buyer and the seller in an international transaction. They indicate which party is responsible for costs and responsibilities. They stipulate the point where the risk passes from buyer to seller in relation to the goods from an insurance perspective. They tell the freight forwarder which party is responsible for which costs. They help calculate the price for payment of import duties and taxes overseas, but most importantly, they eliminate any potential disputes between the buyer and the seller in relation to who is responsible for particular costs and functions. There are approximately 11 Incoterms. 5 or 6 of the more popular ones are EXW, ex-works or ex-factory. That denotes that the price that you've offered on an ex-works basis only includes the cost of the goods sitting in your warehouse ready for sale. Buyers may ask you to supply FOB pricing, free on board. So on top of the cost of the goods sitting in your warehouse, you need to calculate what the cost is to transport them from your warehouse to the ports of loading in Melbourne. The FOB price is the ex-works price, which is the cost of this item sitting in your warehouse. And on top of that ex-works price, you need to add on the domestic transport leg and all the other costs associated with getting the goods from your warehouse to the port of loading. In addition to the transport costs, there are other costs associated with obtaining the proper documentation, freight forwarders costs, there are port charges and terminal fees. So these need to be added to the ex-works price. There's also CFR, cost and freight, which is the cost of the goods, including the Australian charges and the ocean freight to get them to the port of destination. CIF, cost, insurance and freight. The I stands for insurance, and that includes the premium that you would pay to insure the goods. Regardless of what Incoterm you are selling, if you undertake the insurance responsibility, the insurance cover takes care of the goods from warehouse to warehouse. Occasionally, buyers may ask you to quote them a door-to-door price, and you need to arrange all the functions to get them shipped overseas, but also cleared through the overseas customs authorities and through the wharf area, delivered to their warehouse. So an international freight forwarder will assist you in obtaining those costs overseas. And there are 2 terms, which is DAP, deliver at point, and there is DDP, deliver duty paid to your buyer's door. With each Incoterm, it's very important to denote a point of delivery. So for example, we're here in Ballarat today, so if you're selling ex-works, you would show the term as ex-works Ballarat. If you were selling FOB and the cost is to get the goods on board the vessel, you would quote free on board Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide. If it includes the freight component, you would show the term as CFR or CIF Shanghai, Singapore, Los Angeles, again depending on where the buyer has asked you to ship the goods. And if you are selling on a door-to-door basis, you need to show the actual suburb where your buyer or his premises is located. As a seller, once you establish the Incoterm on which your buyer would like to purchase, you would employ the services of a freight forwarder to obtain those costs. So when you call a freight forwarder, if you are quoting on a CIF basis and you need to pay the costs to the overseas port of destination, the freight forwarder can help you obtain all those charges, but they will need certain information from you to be able to obtain those costs. And some of that information includes the size and weights of your product. It needs to have the destination on where they're being shipped to. Occasionally buyers may ask you to deliver the goods by a certain date at destination, so we need to know that as well. Whilst there's many shipping lines and many airlines that service overseas destinations, some are a longer transit, usually cheaper freight rate. Then there are the faster transits, which are slightly more expensive. We need to know the value of your shipment if you need to quote insurance as well. So we would contact an underwriter, an insurance underwriter. Most premiums are based on the value of the shipment, and also what's important is we need to know the commodity, what type of commodity you have. There's general cargo, there's also perishable goods that need to travel at a certain temperature. There's hazardous cargo, so there's more compliancy with local transport and overseas transport that needs to be followed. One of the most important thing is that you need to tell the freight forwarder what Inco terms you are being requested to sell. Another important piece of information that a freight forwarder will ask is what the Inco terms are that you've been asked to quote against. So let's assume that you've been successful in providing a quote to your overseas buyer and they agree to your offer. The next most important thing to do with your buyer is to agree on a method of payment. You as an exporter would much prefer to be paid up front. Whilst that may work on the domestic market, it usually doesn't work internationally. So the second most secure form of payment for an exporter is an irrevocable letter of credit. What happens there is that your buyer overseas will go to his bank and put up a security or collateral to the value of your sale. The bank then establishes a letter of credit, which is a very technical document, and the bank confirms to you, the seller, that they will guarantee payment provided that you follow each and every stipulation on that document. So when you receive your letter of credit from your buyer, it'll be a daunting document. It's quite detailed. The advice there is that you should read through it carefully and make sure that you can accede to every request and stipulation. This is where an international freight forwarder can assist you to interpret what has been listed on the letter of credit. Some of the more common and important things to be aware of is what is the latest expiry date of the letter of credit. The letter of credit will stipulate a latest shipment date. You have to ensure that your production and goods are able to meet that latest shipment date. The letter of credit will show what Inco terms have been agreed to. You need to make sure that that's exactly what you have agreed to with your buyer. They will show the name and the address of the exporter. You need to make sure that the address and names on that letter of credit matches your letterhead. With a letter of credit, if a word is misspelt, it could have serious consequences as to your ability to negotiate payment. Some of the documents which may be requested in a letter of credit are a bill of lading, a commercial invoice, a packing list, possibly an insurance certificate, a phytosanitary certificate depending on the commodity. There may be specific documents required from a shipping company. For example, if you are dealing with the Middle East, your buyer may not want you to utilise a vessel that calls via an Israeli port, and they will write a stipulation into the letter of credit to make sure that you can provide a certificate that that's not going to happen. So we can assist you to obtain any special certificates or requirements that your buyer may have. So what is the bill of lading? It's the most important document in international trade. It serves three functions. It's a receipt for the goods and also the condition in which those goods are received. It's a document of title, and it is an evidence of contract between you, the shipper, and the transport company or the carrier. There are two types of bills of lading. A receipt for shipment bill, which is evidence that the goods have been received by the carrier for intended carriage on board a particular vessel. And then there's a shipped on board bill of lading, which is evidence that the goods have been physically shipped on board and the vessel has sailed from the port of loading. Those are important words. Clean, shipped on board. All letters of credit will ask for shipped on board bills of lading. That way there, the overseas bank and the buyer knows that your goods have been physically put on board and have sailed from Australia. A clean bill of lading is one that doesn't have any notations. If there are notations on the bill of lading, it becomes a dirty bill. So for example, if you deliver goods down to the terminal or to the packing depot, if you've used inferior quality packaging and the packaging is quite flimsy, it'll be notated as being insufficient packaging. That could have dire consequences as to how the goods actually arrive at destination. If you don't properly address and place specific marks and numbers on the packages. Not every vessel is a direct port of call, and occasionally for goods that are transshipped overseas, they may be transshipped at areas where the people at the terminal don't speak English, but they can recognise a particular port of destination. So it's very important that your goods are labelled and addressed properly. Occasionally you may deliver goods down to the wharf, over-dimensional cargo, which may already be rusted, and that will again result in the bill of lading being notated as such and will be a breach of the letter of credit. And another example of a dirty bill is if you have packaged goods in cartons and the transport company has failed to properly protect them on their way to the terminal and it rains and they become wet, they will be notated as received wet. Again, that results in a breach of the letter of credit. An important aspect as well to consider under a dirty bill scenario is that if your cargo arrives at the terminal in bad condition, damaged condition, not only does it have consequences for the letter of credit, it will also have consequences for insurance purposes, and the insurance company may not agree to pay out on a shipment that wasn't presented in a clean way and it wasn't packaged up properly. So that's another thing to be very mindful of, to make sure that your packaging is complete, and regardless of whatever the Inco terms are, your responsibility as a shipper and supplier is that you have to present cargo in a seaworthy condition. Seaworthy condition. So it's your responsibility to make sure that the packaging is appropriate for the size and weight of the product. The bill of lading is prima facie evidence of title of ownership to the goods. The bill of lading can be bought and sold. The letters of credit usually ask for a full set of original bills of lading, and a full set may be 2 signed copies or it could be 3 signed copies. It is standard practice for freight forwarders to issue them in sets. As the bill of lading is such an important document, there are serious consequences if a bill of lading is lost or misplaced. To replace a bill of lading is a very expensive exercise, and usually you need to approach your bank and establish a bank guarantee that indemnifies the carrier, that if someone else picks up that bill of lading and presents it to the carrier on the other side, and the carrier refuses to hand over the goods, they are indemnified in not releasing them. And the bank will charge you a fee per month for that guarantee to be in place, and usually that lasts for up to 7 years. After 7 years, the guarantee can be cancelled and becomes null and void. So for an exporter, The bill of lading is his tool to negotiate payment. So unless he has been paid, he won't hand that over. So if we give you a bill of lading and you lose it, and then James happens to be on the street, picks it up, he can take that overseas to China, to our office, and says, here, I'm the owner of these goods, I have the original bill of lading. Our people would be obligated to hand over those goods. Now, the real buyer can't get his goods because the bill of lading has been lost. And it's the responsibility of the seller to obtain a bank guarantee in the event that the bill of lading is lost. Another important document in our industry is a shipper's letter of instruction, an SLI. It usually doesn't form part of the letter of credit, and it is a document that is completed by the exporter that tells the freight forwarder who the buyer is overseas. It will tell us what Inco terms have been agreed on. It declares the weight and the measurement and type of goods. The information contained therein allows us to undertake export customs clearance formalities. It allows us to prepare the necessary documents for the trucks to enter the depots and terminals. It allows us to issue the bills of lading and also tells us who is responsible for which charges. In addition, it also assists in the preparation of marine insurance declarations, and if required, it allows us to prepare the necessary certificates of origin for compliancy with free trade agreements, because it'll also stipulate the country of origin of the product. So it's almost like a master template of the shipment's information. So from there, we can take information from each section to be able to comply with the different requirements here to prepare the necessary documents for whatever entity. So a shipper's letter of instruction is a written record by the shipper to declare certain information, and it has now become an industry standard that every freight forwarder will require that document to undertake tasks and responsibilities. Some of the more popular modes of transport in international trade are, number one, sea freight. And there are three types of sea freight. There are containers, which come in 20-foot and 40-foot lengths. Occasionally, your buyers will not order enough stock to fill a container, so you would ship your goods as LCL, less than a container load, and you would employ the services of a freight forwarder who will then consolidate your loose cargo into a container with other people who have less than container loads. Under that scenario, you don't pay for the whole container, you pay a pro rata price for whatever amount of room your shipment takes up. There's also break bulk. Break bulk is when your cargo cannot fit within the dimensions of a 20-foot or 40-foot closed container and it's over-dimensional. We can assist in the preparation and the securing of the loads, including transport to the wharf, to be able to comply with Vic roads, obtain necessary permits depending on the over-dimensional specifications. You have air freight, that's probably the second most popular mode, and there are various airlines servicing different destinations. The use of a freight forwarder, again, advisable, because the freight forwarder will be able to consolidate your cargo with other exporters, and they will be able to buy a much cheaper rate per kilo when they take into account everyone else's shipment. We have rail, we have integrated couriers such as DHL, FedEx, UPS, and there's also mail. When you have small parcels, occasionally it is more economical to send the items through air parcels post. Once we have all your shipment specifications, we can do the costings and we can advise you accordingly. So the advice that we would provide on modes of transport will include the quickest route to destination, the most economical method. We can also advise on insurance implications as well as customs compliancy, both domestic and overseas. Australia has a number of agreements with overseas countries that, upon presentation of the proper document, will allow your goods to enter that country at a subsidised duty rate and, in most instances, at a zero rate. In order for your customer to take advantage of those agreements, it is your responsibility to produce the necessary certificates of origin that comply with those free trade agreements. And the certificate of origin will confirm the place of growth, in the case of grains, the place of manufacture, as well as content of different components and their origins. Some certificates of origin are issued by organisations such as the Chamber of Commerce, and for the Chamber to issue those certificates on their letterhead, they will require from you certain declarations as to the origin of the goods, and that's provided on your company's letterhead. Therefore, evidence of origin must be supplied prior to the stamping or approval of those certificates. So whilst a freight forwarder cannot issue the certificates of origin, they can advise you on the information required and the format in which that information needs to be produced in order for the issuing authorities to provide you with a free trade agreement certificate of origin. Some of the risks and consequences in providing incomplete or inaccurate documentation include instances where products are packed and shipped overseas but not properly recorded on the documentation. Occasionally, your customer may request you for items that have been ordered, but they may want 50 units for warranty replacements. And because you're not selling those items and that they're free of charge, exporters make the mistake of not declaring them at all in the consignment. If your shipment happens to be selected by the Overseas Customs Authority for a random inspection, and if it's found that there are more items in the shipment than what's been recorded, that could constitute fraud and a serious attempt at evading taxes or duty. Occasionally, exporters do not provide a packing list, and whilst a packing list doesn't have unit prices or Inco terms, it does help verify the information that is contained on your commercial invoice. Occasionally, exporters will forget to stipulate what currency has been shown on the commercial invoice. Some first-time exporters can produce commercial invoices on a domestic system, but usually for domestic sales, that software doesn't stipulate that it's Australian currency. And if your customer in his original request has asked you to quote in US dollars or in euro, it is a trap, and you need to be mindful that your commercial invoice shows what currency has been agreed to and what currency is being used for the calculation. Another pitfall, and occasionally there's a request by overseas buyers to issue 2 sets of commercial invoices. Whenever that happens, please do not comply. Usually the importer will ask for a second invoice at a lower price, so he may pay less duties and evade taxes. Be very careful. Occasionally, customs will ask the importer to provide proof of payment, price paid for those goods, again as a random check. So if you've received payment for the full amount and your importer has submitted another invoice to customs for customs clearance at a lower value, you will be deemed as having contributed to evasion of duties and taxes. Again, I stress, only issue 1 commercial invoice for the exact amount that was agreed to and paid for. It's very important to show the country of origin on your documentation. There may be countries that don't have a free trade agreement with Australia, and they may have a preferential duty rate. It's not the full amount of duty, and it's not zero duty, but it might be a subsidised duty rate. So it's very important to clarify the country of origin. And most of all, the most important piece of information to show on your commercial paperwork, on your invoice, is the Inco term that's been agreed to. That will ensure that there are no disputes or disagreements between you and your overseas buyer. So just to recap, to be an effective exporter, you must be aware of your customers' requirements, ensure that your product is packed and presented in a seaworthy condition, ensure that you select the correct mode of transport to meet time-sensitive dates, have your documentation prepared on time and accurately, clarify the Inco terms and which party is responsible for the marine insurance, and very important to be aware and to be assured that you are not alone in this journey, that there is a wealth of information and advice that an international freight forwarder can help you with. So if everything we've covered today seems a bit daunting, the best advice I can give you is to contact an international freight forwarder who will be most pleased to assist you in every aspect of international trade, and especially in exporting overseas.